Spilling coffee on the Montreal Syndicate's enforcer was supposed to be a death sentence. For Penny Kowalczyk, it was just a Tuesday. The Auberge Noire occupied the top 3 floors of a converted heritage building on Rue Saint-Paul, the kind of place where the marble floors cost more than Penny's entire apartment building in Verdun, and the clientele included at least 2 sitting MPs who probably shouldn't have been sitting together. The restaurant on the 41st floor was a legitimate business. A very, very good one. The private suites on 42 and 43 were not. Penny had been working the floor for 11 days, long enough to know which tables were business, which were pleasure, and which were both in ways that could get a person quietly disappeared into the St. Lawrence. Staffing agency had sent her without any real warning, just an address, a dress code, and a pay rate that made her laugh out loud on the bus ride over, because surely that was a typo. It was not a typo. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and somewhere in the neighborhood of 280 pounds of anxious energy, thick hips, and an unfortunate magnetic relationship with disaster. She had grown up in a Verdun walk-up with a single mum who worked double shifts at the dépanneur, and she had the very specific skillful set of someone who'd had to be competent at everything, because there was nobody else to pick up the slack. She could do the books for a small business in her head. She could de-escalate a crying drunk at last call. She could carry 4 plates on one arm and remember 7 drink orders without writing them down. What she could not do, not reliably, not under pressure, was navigate a room without finding the one loose floor tile, the one chair leg sticking out 2 centimeters too far, the one step that was a 1/4 inch lower than expected. The laws of physics had it out for her personally. She'd accepted this. What she had not accepted, standing outside Suite 42 on a rainy Wednesday evening, balancing a tray of aged single malt and chilled water with the focused concentration of someone diffusing a bomb, was that tonight would be the night the floor, tile, chose violence. She felt her right heel catch, felt the shift in her center of gravity with the particular sickening clarity of someone who had felt it many, many times before. Her left hand shot out reflexively, which only changed the trajectory of the tray rather than saving it. The scotch went up. Then it came down, directly onto the sleeve and shoulder of Callum Maguire, who was standing in the open doorway of Suite 42, holding a phone to his ear and wearing what Penny would later learn was a made-to-measure charcoal suit from a tailor on Avenue Montaigne in Paris. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She knew who he was. Anyone who'd worked this building for more than 3 days knew who he was. Callum Maguire, 51. Irish-Canadian, 3rd generation, with a grandmother from Galway and a grandfather who'd come to Montreal with nothing and built something that was definitively not nothing, depending on how you define that word. He ran Maguire Holdings, which was a logistics and real estate firm on paper and something considerably more layered off paper. He was the kind of man who made city councillors check their phones when his name came up in conversation, and not because they were expecting a friendly text. He was looking at her now. The phone was still at his ear, but he'd stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes were grey-green, the colour of the St. Lawrence in October, and they were absolutely, completely still. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and ended the call. Penny did the only thing her nervous system had available, crouched down and started picking up the glass. "I am so sorry," she said to the floor, because she couldn't look at him yet. "I will pay for the dry cleaning. I realize that's probably a laughable offer given what that suit costs, but I will pay for it in installments over the next several years, if necessary. I may also owe you a small apology on behalf of my entire skeletal system, which has never once cooperated with me at a critical moment." Another silence. Then, "Get up." His voice was low and unhurried, with the flattened vowels of someone raised in NDG, not cruel, not warm either, just very, very certain. Penny stood up, a shard of glass in one hand and the empty tray in the other. She made herself look at him directly because her mother had taught her that the worst thing you could do when you'd made a mistake was look away from it. "Francine is going to fire me," she said. "I understand that. but for what it's worth, I genuinely did not do this on purpose, and I have very good references from my last 4 jobs. Callum Maguire looked at her for a long moment. At the uniform she'd already tailored herself, because the standard issue hadn't fit across the shoulders. At the hair escaping its clip, at the way she was holding the broken glass away from her body with the careful practicality of someone used to cleaning up messes without making them worse. "What's your name?" he said. Not a question, more like a fact he was deciding to collect. "Penny Kowalczyk. Where are you from?" "Penny Kowalczyk. Verdun. Born and raised." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. He looked down at the spreading amber stain on his sleeve, then back at her. "Go tell Francine you're reassigned. You're working this suite for the rest of the evening. I just poured scotch on you, I'm aware. Go!" She went, and she found out later from one of the senior servers who pulled her aside near the service elevator with the urgent tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis, that 6 people had been removed from Suite 42 service rotation in the past 4 months. Removed was the word he used, carefully, and Penny understood from the weight he put on it that he didn't mean fired. He went home that night on the metro and sat very still, and thought hard about the rent in Verdun and her mother's pharmacy bills, and the fact that she was objectively still alive and employed. She went back the next shift. She kept going back. The problem was that Penny was good at her job in ways that had nothing to do with not spilling things. She had a memory like a card catalogue. She noticed things, noticed that the man at table 3 was lying to the man across from him based on the micro-delay before his answers. She noticed that the ventilation in the private corridor was making a sound it hadn't made last week. Noticed, on her 9th shift in Suite 42, that the invoices she'd been asked to sort into Callum's briefcase, just the invoices, Francine had said, just put them in order by date, it'll take 2 minutes, contained a billing discrepancy of somewhere in the range of $40,000 that did not appear accidental. She stood in the empty suite for a very long time looking at the numbers. Then she put them in date order. She put them in the briefcase. She went back to the floor and served the rest of her shift and said nothing. She was not an idiot. She understood perfectly well what kind of building she was working in and what kind of man she was working for. She also understood that $40,000 missing from a ledger, if it was found by someone who wasn't supposed to find it, had a habit of becoming someone else's problem in a permanent way. It lasted 3 more shifts before she couldn't stand it anymore. Mr. Maguire. She appeared in the doorway of the suite on a quiet Thursday afternoon when he was working alone, jacket off, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the elbow. He looked up. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not shoot the messenger, which I realize is a strange thing to say to a person, but I've been thinking about how to start this conversation for 4 days, and I couldn't think of a better opening." He set down his pen. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand, and in case I need to leave quickly." A pause. "Tell me," she told him. She'd written the figures on a piece of paper from memory. She hadn't kept copies of anything. She wasn't stupid, and she slid it across the table. The discrepancy, the account codes that didn't match, the freight invoices that billed for routes that didn't exist in the system she'd sorted. Callum looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You memorized this," he said. "Numbers don't trip over their own feet," Penny said. "That's the one thing they've got going for them." He didn't smile, but something in his face changed in a way she couldn't quite name, like a room where someone had adjusted the light by a single degree. He picked up his phone and made a call in low, clipped sentences she couldn't fully follow. Then he put the phone down and looked at her again. "Who else have you told?" "Nobody, obviously. Why?" She considered this. "Because it wasn't my money and it wasn't my business, technically. But someone is stealing from you and I've been on the other end of being stolen from my whole life, and I find it annoying on principle." He picked up the paper and looked at it again. "You'll be compensated for this." "I don't need to be compensated. I need to keep my job, and I'd like to not be in any trouble for knowing something I probably shouldn't know." "You're not in trouble," he said. He and his voice had a quality she'd learned to recognize over the following weeks, the kind of certainty that didn't need volume behind it because it had never been wrong. She walked back to the floor. Her hands were shaking. She did not spill anything for the rest of that shift, which she considered a personal record under the circumstances. What Penny did not fully account for was the way things began to change after that conversation. Not dramatically, not all at once. Callum Maguire was not a man who made dramatic gestures, but she started to notice small things, the way you notice a change in weather before you can name it. The suite rotation changed. She was no longer assigned elsewhere on nights he was in the building. Mentioned, in passing to another server, that the freight elevator scared her because the door had a habit of closing before she was fully through it. It was repaired within 48 hours. There was no announcement and no explanation. One evening she arrived for her shift to find a new pair of non-slip work shoes in her locker in her size, which she had definitely not ordered. There was no note. She stood there holding them for a long time. She was trying very hard not to feel things about Callum Maguire that were inappropriate to feel about an employer, especially this particular employer. She was mostly failing. It was a Tuesday in November when the careful, manageable shape of things fell completely apart. Callum was in meetings all day. Difficult meetings, the kind she'd learned to identify by the quality of the silence in the corridor afterward, and the way Declan, his most senior and most stone-faced associate, stopped making eye contact with the service staff. There was a situation, was all anyone said when she asked. Someone from a crew out of Toronto was making demands about the harbour access that had been Maguire territory since before Penny was born. She wasn't supposed to know any of this. Pieced it together from fragments over weeks, the way you piece together a conversation through a wall. Imperfectly, incompletely, but accurately enough to worry. At 7:45, she went to the service entrance for her break. She needed air. The back alley behind Rue Saint-Paul was unglamorous but quiet, and she'd started taking her breaks there because the roof access was locked and the front entrance required walking past the maitre d', who had opinions about servers taking breaks within visible range of guests. She didn't make it to the alley. A black SUV was idling at the mouth of the service lane, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the door opening as she approached. What was more unusual was the man who stepped out, compact and wire-strung, and wearing the kind of expression that people wore when they'd decided something already and were just going through the formalities. "Kowalczyk," he said, which told her he knew exactly who she was. "Maguire's girl. Come with us. Mitch wants to talk." Mitch Verdun. She'd heard the name, Gyun. Everyone who worked the building had heard the name, in the same way you'd heard the name of a specific dangerous intersection. Not because you'd been there, but because enough people had warned you about it. "I'm on my break," Penny said, which was genuinely the stupidest thing she'd ever said, and she had once apologized to a revolving door. The man took her by the arm. She thrashed. She was not small, and she was not weak, and she was very, very motivated, but there were 3 of them, and they were practiced at this in a way she was not. They got her into the vehicle. Her head caught the doorframe going in, and the cold October air turned into a blurry, ringing darkness. She came around in a warehouse. Of course it was a warehouse. The floor was concrete and smelled of machine oil and the river. Her wrists were zip-tied behind a metal chair. Her head ached with a brightness she recognized from the one time she'd walked into the open door of her mother's kitchen cabinet going around a corner too fast. Mitch Verdun was shorter than she'd expected. Wiry, with quick eyes and the particular restlessness of a man who'd spent his whole life convincing himself he deserved more than he had. "Word is Maguire's fond of you," he said, pacing. "Unusual. He's not usually fond of people." "He tips decently," Penny said. "I think it's professional respect." Mitch smiled without warmth. He held up a phone. "We're going to call him, and he's going to agree to pull his people from the bar terminals. And then we'll bring you back." "And if he doesn't agree?" Mitch's smile didn't change. He dialed. The line connected almost immediately. He heard the quality of the silence on the other end before anyone spoke. The kind of silence that had mass and temperature, and she knew somehow with total certainty that Callum had already known this was coming. "Maguire?" Mitch's voice went up half a register, trying to sound casual. "I've got someone here who works for you. Wants to say hello. Don't." Callum's voice, quiet as a closed door. "Don't what? Don't put her on. It won't change anything, and she doesn't need to hear whatever you say next." Mitch looked at Penny with a kind of baffled annoyance, then brought the phone to her anyway. "Say hello." Penny took a breath. "I want you to know," she said, her voice remarkably steady given everything, "that I walked into this entirely on my own because I was getting air, which is something I'm going to think about differently going forward. Yeah. Also, I may have a mild concussion, which is honestly just consistent with my broader life experience. Don't agree to anything on my account. I have a very hard head." A silence. Then very quietly, "Are you hurt? Define hurt. Penny mild. I promise." "Don't." Mitch took the phone back. "Hear that? She's cooperative. 24 hours, Maguire. Terminals, or this gets less cooperative." The line was silent for a breath. When Callum spoke again, his voice had dropped to something flat and colourless and absolutely without temperature. "You should not have touched her." The line went dead. Mitch stared at the phone. Nothing in his expression had shifted. "Lock it down," he said to his men, with the slightly elevated pace of someone recalibrating. Left alone with a single guard near the door, Penny sat with the particular focused calm of someone who had no good options and was therefore free to think clearly. Her hands were behind her back. The zip tie was tight. The chair was metal, which meant it wasn't going to cooperate the way a wooden chair might. But her hands weren't tied to the chair itself, just behind her back. She'd dislocated her left shoulder at 17, falling off a mutual friend's roof. It had gone back in at the hospital, and the physio afterward had left her with a flexibility on that side that she'd never found a use for until right now. It took 7 agonizing minutes, and what she estimated was a minor re-aggravation of the old injury. But her hands came in front of her, wrists still zip-tied but functional. She looked at the guard, who had his back to her, looked at the metal shelving unit 2 meters to her left, loaded with old equipment, listing slightly on one uneven leg. Penny had not been coordinated a single day in her life. She had, however, developed an extremely well-calibrated understanding of falling things. Stood up slowly. She moved to the shelf. She braced herself against it and pushed. With all 280 pounds of determined momentum, at the exact angle that would bring it down across the guard's path rather than directly onto him, because she was clumsy and she was terrified, but she was not trying to kill anyone. The crash was catastrophic. Guard went down with the shelf, pinned by the weight of the equipment, unhurt but very thoroughly stuck. He started yelling, stepped over his legs and ran, her tied wrists in front of her like she was offering something. She made it to a side door before it opened from the outside. Declan caught her by the shoulders, looked at her face, and said something in Irish under his breath that didn't need translation. Behind him, the warehouse exploded into controlled, economical chaos. She didn't see most of what happened. Declan took her outside and put her in an armored vehicle and told her to stay, which she did because she had used every unit of adrenaline she possessed and her left shoulder felt like it had opinions. Through the vehicle's tinted window, the building flickered with movement and once, sharply, a sound she didn't want to name. Then it was quiet. The door opened and Callum folded himself into the seat beside her. He was in tactical clothing that looked wrong on him in the way that unexpected things always look wrong. Not because they didn't fit, but because you'd never pictured them before. There was a cut along his jaw that was still bleeding a little. He looked at her with the careful, complete attention of someone taking inventory. "Your shoulder," he said. "Old injury. I just made it briefly worse. It's fine." He reached over very slowly and took her zip-tied wrists in both hands, produced a small blade and cut the tie in one clean motion. Then he held her wrists for a moment, thumb moving across the marks the plastic had left, and didn't let go. "You pushed a shelf onto a man," he said. "I pushed a shelf near a man. There's a distinction." Declan said you'd already gotten yourself to the door by the time we breached. I was not going to just sit there. She paused. I mean, I did sit there for a while. I'm not reckless. First. He looked at her for a long moment. In the low light of the vehicle, she could see the specific quality of his expression. Something stripped back that she'd never seen on him before, in all the weeks of carefully maintained professional distance. I need you to understand something, he said. Okay. What happened tonight will not happen again, Chin. I will make structural changes to ensure it. Callum, I also need you to understand, he continued, with the same measured cadence, that the reason I am still sitting here instead of dealing with the rest of this, the reason I drove myself rather than sending Declan, is not professional. Penny looked at him. It is not professional at all, he said, and I've been aware of that for longer than is probably reasonable to admit. Sound of rain on the vehicle's roof. Distant ordinary hum of the city going about its business on the other side of the warehouse district. I spilled scotch on your suit, Penny said. On my first night, I know, a made-to-measure suit. From Paris. I know where it was made. I'm just saying that you had information very early on about what kind of person I am. I did, he said. Yeah. I filed it accordingly. She looked at his hands, still holding her wrists at the cut on his jaw, at the man who ran the Montreal syndicate from a heritage building on Rue Saint-Paul, sitting in an armored truck in the rain, holding her hands like she was something he'd been afraid of losing. Okay, she said, which was not what she'd planned to say, but was the most honest thing available to her. Okay, he agreed. He drove her home himself. He waited until she was inside, and when she got to the 3rd floor, she looked out the window, and the black vehicle was still there, engine idling in the rain, and she understood without being told that it would stay there until morning. Her shoulder ached. Her head ached. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table in Verdun, in the apartment she'd grown up in, listening to the rain on the fire escape. Her phone buzzed, a message from a number she didn't have saved. The shoulder? Get it looked at tomorrow. I'll arrange it. Stared at the message for a while. I've had it looked at before, she typed back. It's fine, go deal with your actual evening. A pause. Then, my actual evening is managed. Sleep. Did not tell him that she smiled at her phone in the dark kitchen, like a complete idiot. Some information a person got to keep. The months after that moved differently. Not loudly, not with speeches or declarations. Callum Maguire was not a man who announced himself. He was a man who quietly ensured things. Hilda was seen by a physio on Sherbrooke, who turned out to be thorough and excellent and didn't ask questions. The loose tile in the service corridor of the Auberge Noire was replaced within a week. When one of the sous chefs made a comment in the service kitchen about her size that he probably thought no one important had heard, he was not there the following Thursday, and nobody mentioned why. Penny noticed these things the way she noticed everything, quietly, completely, filing them in the card catalogue of her very good memory. She learned the shape of his world slowly, the way you learn a city you've moved to, rather than been born in. Yeah. The Maguire syndicate was old and organized, and ran on a kind of internal logic that was genuinely coherent once you understood the framework. Even if the framework involved things she would not be able to explain to her mother in Verdun, who believed her daughter worked logistics, hospitality, and asked no follow-up questions, because she recognized the look on Penny's face that meant please don't. She also learned the shape of him, the way he became very still when he was actually angry as opposed to the performative coldness he used for professional purposes. The fact that he had read everything, not as a hobby, as a compulsion. The way he took his coffee, which was with exactly 1 sugar and a frankly inexplicable amount of suspicion toward oat milk. The fact that he had grown up on the same metro line she had, 6 stops closer to downtown, and had spent his early 20s determined to build something that would outlast the neighborhood's doubts about whether a Maguire could be more than what the Maguires had always been. She told him once, given lying on the roof of the Auberge Noire, on a July night when the city was loud and warm below them, that she'd spent most of her life feeling like she was too much and not enough at the same time. Too loud, too round, too clumsy, too Hamilton County level unlucky. Not polished enough for the spaces she was trying to occupy. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without any particular inflection, "Yeah. You walked into my world and found a $40,000 discrepancy in your second week. You got yourself out of a locked warehouse, and you have never once pretended to be something you're not in a world that runs entirely on people pretending." A pause. "You are entirely sufficient, Penny. You were sufficient before you walked into the building." She didn't say anything. The city hummed below them. "Also," he said, "you spilled scotch on a suit that cost $4,000, and I gave you a promotion. I think my summation on them was clear from the beginning." She laughed, which startled a pigeon off the roof ledge and caused her to knock over her water glass, which rolled across the rooftop and fell 4 stories to the alley below. She cringed. He watched the glass fall, looked back at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that she had decided privately was the most valuable thing in Montreal. She was not the woman any of them would have predicted for this. She knew that. She'd heard the assessments, carefully not quite within earshot, from the men who'd served Callum Maguire for years. It was too young, too messy, too much of an outsider, too comfortable taking up space in rooms where people like her weren't supposed to exist. She existed anyway. She had always existed anyway, and Callum Maguire, and spent decades being feared and respected and carefully obeyed, had chosen for entirely his own reasons the woman who talked to revolving doors and tripped over good intentions and kept her family's accounts in her head and did not look away from mistakes. He told her once, quietly on a night when the syndicate's business had been difficult, and the weight of it was visible in the set of his shoulders in a way he would never have allowed anyone else to see. "You're the first person in this building who never wanted anything from me." "I wanted my job," she said. "You wanted your job," he agreed. "That's different." The outside the window of the Auberge Noir was wet and bright and continuously, reliably itself. Below the St. Lawrence moved toward the ocean the way it always had, cold and purposeful, and unimpressed by anyone's ambitions. Penny Kowalczyk, who had grown up 6 stops down the metro line with a mother who worked doubles and a gravity problem that had never once resolved itself, had somehow landed in the center of something that was nothing like anything she'd planned, straightened his lapel where it had caught wrong. This was something she did automatically now, without thinking, the way you reach for a familiar mug. And he looked at her the way he'd looked at her since the night of the scotch and the ruined sleeve and the $4,000 suit that he had never once mentioned again. She knocked over his water glass on the way out. She apologized to it. He watched her go. He was still smiling when Declan walked in 2 minutes later, which Declan logged in his memory as genuinely unprecedented and chose not to remark on, because he had survived this long by recognizing which observations were worth having out loud.